On our last video covering the story of Joan of Arc, we discussed how a peasant girl from a simple village in eastern France rallied a ravaged kingdom to halt the English and Burgundian advances at the city of Orleans. Today we shall continue to follow the Maid of Orleans on her mission to place the crown atop Charles VII's head and to end the English pretensions on France once and for all.
June 14th, Orleans. Our rescue of Orleans was a setback for our enemies, but only a minor one. The British still possess half of France. Tragically, we have cooled our heels for weeks while the Dauphin's advisors debate. Joan became irritated with the delay and reassembled her army. She talks of nothing but her mission to drive the British into the sea. The force of Joan's will is titanic. She has gathered to her banner swearing brigands and knaves and turns them into patriots and heroes. Among them is the man La Hire. A giant clad in plate mail, he drives men on with curses and fists. There will be plenty of British necks for La Hire to break at Patay. Patay is the gateway to the Loire River Valley. The British hold the Loire in a grip of steel, whilst a huge army under Sir John Fastolf devastates the countryside. Joan leads us to Patay to capture the British castles. However, we must avoid Fastolf's army till we are strong enough to face his veterans.
As significant as the relief of Orleans was to the morale of the French armies and to the belief in Joan's divine providence, it had still not held back the English enough to put them on the back foot, and an English counterattack seemed but a matter of time. For the following weeks, the Duc d'Alençon struck at the Loire village to retake control of the key river crossings and the towns controlling them. By the 18th of June, his forces had managed to take Jargeau, Mont-sur-Loire and Beaugency. To counter these assaults, the English had sent an army under Sir John Fastolf, who was much more cautious to face the French than the scenario plays him out to be. Fastolf's army was on the march to relieve their comrades, but after the fall of Beaugency, they turned tail back to Paris. Learning this, the French forces set out on hot pursuit, with our favorite champion leading the vanguard.
La Hire wishes to kill something.
It was not long till La Hire and his vanguard spotted the English army, who was not in a defensible position, and they took the initiative, charging at the exposed English longbowmen before their main force arrived to give battle. The English were not expecting the French to be so close and were caught completely off guard. La Hire's cavalry crashed through the English archers, routing them from the field, and leaving the English main force completely exposed. A few managed to flee La Hire's sword, but most were not so lucky, and the Battle of Patay turned out to be a massive cavalry mopping up operation. This engagement was an unmitigated disaster for the English that resulted in almost all of their officers being captured and most of their soldiers either killed or captured.
La Hire's sword is not bloody enough.
After Patay, the myth of British invulnerability was dispelled. Now, our army knows it is possible to win, but only if we are resolute and cunning. The British are a most deadly enemy, and their longbowmen time and again have decimated a charge of French knights. To make matters worse, we now face enemies on both sides. The Dauphin's advisors spend more and more time wrangling, jealous of Jean's influence at court. I pray that Jean can complete her divine mission before the Dauphin's envious advisors betray her. June 25th, Orleans. Dead France is returning to life. Our army swells with new recruits. In olden times, men swore fealty only to their particular lord. Now we fight not for insolent lords and ladies, but for France. For all of us, Jean is France. There is no distinction in our minds. The Dauphin himself has arrived in Orleans. Never have I seen such a celebration. France needs a king, so we must escort the Dauphin to Reims, where he can be properly crowned. Yet, the city of Reims is dangerously menaced by the Anglo-Burgundian army. The cities of Troyes and Chalons also bar the way. Jean commands that we must liberate all three cities before the coronation, and we eagerly seek to fight.
Following the resounding victories along the Loire River and the English armies being dealt two serious blows back to back, the Dauphin felt secure enough to accept Joan's invitation to get him crowned at Reims. However, Charles would not leave anything to chance and gathered all the men he could, giving Joan disposal of 12,000 men. On the 24th of June, they set off with what seemed like to be the entirety of France in tow. This scenario is another one in which the geographical scale of what transpired during these battles could not be translated onto the minimap. For as you can see here, the march of Joan's army to Reims was a huge trek from one key city to another, going around the English stronghold at Paris. This glorious march truly indicated how the tide had started turning in the favor of the French, and by the time they reached Reims, even the Burgundians began retreating away from Paris out of fear. By mid-July, the royal host had arrived at Reims, which itself had not attempted to resist their soon-to-be sovereign, and finally, the way was clear for Charles VII to be able to walk those steps up to the altar.
As we rode into Reims, a sea of peasants and lords knelt before Jean. Some even knelt to kiss our horses' hoofprints. Cannon thundered, and 1,000 flags danced in the breeze. In the enormous palace, the Dauphin knelt before the Archbishop and rose as King of France. Prayers, anthems, and sermons filled the great chateau. Interspersed among perfumed dukes and ladies were tattered soldiers from our army, many still bearing wounds. Jeanne herself was at the king's side, as was her bedraggled battle standard. Despite the celebration, I know in my heart that this war is far from over. Our fathers and grandfathers died fighting against the English. Jeanne gives us hope, but I do not know if hope is enough to ensure victory. September 3rd, Reims. France has a king once more. However, as Jean gains influence with the people, jealousy grows within the court. The king's evil advisors now seek to destroy Jean. It's only a matter of time before they succeed in poisoning the king's mind. Jean must hurry to fulfill her mission. Paris, the jewel of France, has been under English tyranny for decades, and French patriots trapped within the city are eager to escape. We are now marching on Paris, hoping that the reinforcements we have been promised will arrive in time.
The coronation of Charles VII made it clear to everyone that the tides had shifted in the 100 Years' War and that the Armagnacs were very much on the front foot from here on out. The royal court wanted to proceed with caution and try to reach a settlement of some kind with the English, and especially with the Burgundians, whom he wanted to bring back into the fold. However, Joan of Arc was as fiery as ever to push the English out of France completely, and she set off for Paris in September with a promise of reinforcements from the Dauphin as soon as she could. Accompanying Joan in this scenario, we meet two new heroes, Jean de la Lorraine, who was actually a Burgundian duke who played a key role in Joan's upcoming misfortunes, and Lord de Graville, a seasoned military commander with numerous engagements under his belt, including Orleans. This scenario does its best to squeeze Paris and Compiègne in it, which is not that close to Paris as the minimap would have us believe. However, the major discrepancy with the actual siege of Paris is the location of John's forces, which had attacked at the gate of Saint-Honor, which lay at the northern end of the city, but this change is very understandable for the gameplay elements. The siege of Paris would not go the same way as John's previous engagements went, and she would be repulsed at the walls due to the citizens' adamant defense believing that the Armagnacs had come to raze the city to the ground. This was compounded by the failure, and many would call betrayal, of the Dauphin in not sending the promised reinforcements to Joan. Why the king did not send the reinforcements he promised is not certain, with some claiming that he believed Joan had outlived her usefulness, to others explaining that he simply did not have enough men to go around. Whatever the case, Joan was forced to call off the siege, and she withdrew, spending the following months campaigning with not much to show for it. In May of the following year, she wrote to help relieve the city of Compiègne, when disaster struck.
Tragedy. As the refugees fled into the chateau of Compiègne, Jeanne was trapped outside. Burgundian soldiers knocked her from her horse and paraded around with their prisoner. None of us can sleep, knowing our precious Joan of Arc languishes in a Burgundian prison. The soldiers stare at the uncaring sky, condemning themselves for being unable to save her, for being unable to save France. Paris was the first major defeat ever dealt to our army. Had the king sent the promised reinforcements, we would have captured the city. Now, it is France's darkest hour. July 14, Bordeaux. No Joan of Arc. A rich world made empty and poor. The English put her on trial as a heretic. Jeanne's mind was as sharp as her sword, and she avoided all the cunning verbal traps of her prosecutors. In the end, Jeanne would not renounce her mission. The English found her guilty and burned her at the stake. But her death is not in vain. La Pucelle is the rallying cry as peasant and noblemen alike take arms. My army is an army of the people, and even without the king, we are poised to strike at the English stronghold of Castillon. A victory at Castillon will crush the English pretensions in France forever. Should I die in this battle, I die for the Maid of Orleans. I die as a patriot of France.
As laid out in this heart-wrenching cutscene, Joan of Arc was put on trial for heresy by the English, who wanted to discredit her divine claims, seeing this to be essential to strike at French morale. However, burning her at the stake filled the French with a vengeful spirit that would not rest until all the English were pushed from France forever. During this cutscene, there is a huge time jump that we are not made aware of, as Jean was executed in 1431, but the Battle of Castillon happened 22 years later in 1453. During this period, the Armagnacs pushed hard against the English and even managed to reconcile with the Burgundians in 1435 with the Treaty of Arras, ending the French Civil War. Then in 1450 at Formigny, the French decidedly defeated the English, resulting in their loss of all their remaining territories with the exception of Calais in the north and Bordeaux in the south. Thus, in 1453, the English sent a last-ditch effort to regain some ground in Gascony in the south, which leads us to our final scenario where we meet the narrator of our tale.
Sweet Jeanne, I shall avenge thee.
We also meet our last two heroes, the Constable Richemont, who was the Duke of Brittany and an initial skeptic of Joan but was later one of her strongest supporters, and Dave.
Dadgum.
I mean, Jean Bourreau.
We'll see how British longbows fare against French cannon.
Whose leadership and use of artillery was instrumental during the coming battle. This scenario does a good job with the location for the Battle of Castillon. However, as we mentioned earlier, the Burgundians were no longer enemies of the Armagnacs at this point. The fighting mostly took part in the area where you meet your army during the scenario, and the battle itself was a hard affair. But the French emerged decidedly victorious, effectively ending the English claims on the French crown once and for all.
A century of English toil blood and victories was reversed in a little over a year by a teenage girl. The 100 Years' War has ended. Even more importantly, Joan's acts reignited a sense of French nationalism. Peasants and nobles alike no longer belong to lords and kings, but to France herself. We will not let Joan be forgotten. Already statues and stained glass portraits have been commissioned in hundreds of towns and cities throughout France. Her verdict of guilt was rightfully reversed, and eventually Joan of Arc was beatified as a saint. Sometimes the outcome of history is determined by strength of arms, other times by happenstance. But in 15th century France, history was determined by the will of a young girl, the only person in history to command the armies of an entire nation at the age of 17.
The French victory at Castillon marked the end of the 100 Years' War and a tidal shift in Western European power, for the English would gradually collapse into vicious infighting for generations as a direct result of their defeats in France, whereas the French crown would henceforth be an ascendant power that would dominate the region for the following 2 centuries. With regards to Joan of Arc, her heresy trial was redone by the French in 1456, and she was unsurprisingly found innocent of her charges. Even though La Pucelle had suffered greatly at the hands of her captors, her death was not the end. Her spirit lived on to inspire her followers to fulfill her mission in her memory, and centuries later, in 1920, she was canonized as a saint by Pope Benedict XV. Whether you are a believer or a skeptic of Joan's claims, what is undeniable is that whoever she was, Joan of Arc captured the imagination of her people in such a manner that very few people have ever done. So much so that to this day she is still remembered as a symbol of resilience and a patron saint of France.